Montana Territory. Autumn of 1879, the wind over the prairie carried the bite of approaching winter, and Ezekiel Thorne had already decided he would not survive another season of hope. He swung down from his gelding, boots crunching against frost-hardened soil. The ranch house stood quiet behind him, weather-stained and lonely, just like him. 4 years had passed since the war took everything: his brother, his parents, and her. The woman he once thought he would marry had died, giving birth to a child that never took its first breath. After that, Ezekiel buried his heart out by the cottonwoods. He told himself he would never love again, and he meant it. So when the wagon creaked up his long dirt road that morning, wheels struggling through brittle grass, he figured it was a stray traveler, maybe someone needing water or directions. What he did not expect was a woman climbing down with a baby in her arms and a tear-streaked face that looked like it had not seen peace in a long time. "Are you Ezekiel Thorne?" Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped forward, coat threadbare, boots dusty, holding the child close. "My name is Delaney Archer. I have something for you." The baby squirmed in her arms, letting out a soft cry. Delaney rocked him gently, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded letter, the paper worn and creased. She held it out with fingers that trembled. "This is from my sister. Her name was Clara." Ezekiel's chest went tight. "Clara," Delaney's voice broke as she said it. "You knew her, didn't you?" He took the letter, but his hands had gone cold. "I did." Delaney looked down. "She passed 2 weeks ago. Fever got her fast. I buried her myself out near Blacktail Creek." The wind blew hard across the porch. Ezekiel's throat worked as he stared at the letter. "And the baby," Delaney shifted the child gently. "This is her son. His name's Liam," she said. "She said you were his father." Ezekiel's world tilted. "That's not possible." "She wrote everything in the letter," Delaney said. "Said she never told you. Said she was scared." He opened the letter with stiff hands, ink blurred, soaked through in places by tears. Clara's handwriting curled soft across the page. She told him about Liam, about how she had loved him still, even after they had gone different ways. About how she had no one else to send the boy to. She begged him to be kind. Delaney wrapped her arms around Liam as she stood in silence. She did not cry anymore. She looked too worn for that. Ezekiel's voice was low. "Why did you bring him here?" "Because he's yours. And because I made her a promise." He stared at the baby. Liam had a tuft of dark hair and round cheeks. He looked nothing like Ezekiel, but something about him still pulled at his chest. "I don't know anything about raising a child," he said. Delaney nodded. "Neither do I. But I am not leaving him behind." Ezekiel looked up sharply. "You're staying?" "I came across half the territory with him. I got no money left, no family either, just a promise to keep and a baby who needs a warm place." He looked past her to the wagon, only one mule hitched. Not much in the back: blankets, a canteen, a few jars of preserved peaches. She had come here with nothing. He stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside." Delaney's shoulders dropped a little. She followed him in, holding Liam close. The house was plain: one main room, a stone hearth, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed up against the wall. He lit the lamp and stoked the fire, then took her coat and hung it on the peg. She moved slow, like her joints hurt. "I have stew left," he said. "Hope you do not mind venison." "I do not mind anything warm." He ladled the stew into 2 bowls. Delaney sat with Liam on her lap, helping him curl into her side. The baby had fallen asleep, small mouth open, tiny fist gripping her shirt. They ate in silence. The fire crackled. Her eyes wandered the room, pausing on the rifle by the door, the old photograph on the mantel, his family before the war. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do. You always this quiet?" Ezekiel glanced at her. "Used to talk more, not much reason to now." She nodded like she understood. "I used to laugh a lot before Clara got sick, before we lost Ma and Pa. Things change." He watched the way she tucked the blanket around Liam, how her hand lingered on his cheek. "You his aunt." "I am, but I raised him the last few months. Clara was too weak. He cried a lot at first. Missed her even before she was gone." Ezekiel looked at the fire. "He'll miss her for a while." Delaney's voice dropped. "Me too." After the dishes were washed, he offered her his bed. She tried to refuse, but the exhaustion in her eyes gave her away. He brought in a cot from the barn and laid it by the hearth. Liam slept through it all, as if he knew this place was safer than the road they had left behind. Later, as the fire died down, Ezekiel sat up in the dark, listening to the soft sounds of the baby breathing and Delaney's quiet sighs as she finally slept. He had sworn he would never let love near him again. But here she was, an exhausted woman with a baby he had not known he had, and a letter that had cracked something open in his chest. He looked at them both, and he felt it stir, not love, not yet, but something that could grow. The rooster hadn't yet called when Ezekiel stepped outside into the pale dawn. Frost powdered the earth like sifted flour, and breath hung in the air between him and the barn door. The sky was still draining its darkness, stars fading slow into the blue. He carried the axe with him, slung across his shoulder, and set to splitting kindling without thought, letting the rhythm dull the questions that hadn't stopped since he read Clara's letter. By the time the sun crested the ridge, Delaney was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a woolen shawl he'd left out for her. Her hair was pinned low, a few wisps blowing loose as the wind picked up. Liam was nowhere in sight, but Ezekiel could hear the soft cooing from inside. "You've got a milk cow?" she asked, arms crossed over her middle. "She don't give much this late in the year, enough for coffee and biscuits if you stretch it." Delaney stepped down onto the packed earth, her boots crunching the thin frost. "I could try warming her feed with mash." "Help her yield. You know cattle, some." "My father was a drover before he took to carpentry, taught us girls most everything he knew." Ezekiel studied her a moment. "You planning to stay long enough to try?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes moved to the hills beyond the pasture, where the grass had turned brittle and the trees had shaken off most their leaves. "I don't see where else I'd go." He shifted his grip on the axe. "There's a lot of quiet out here." "Not much in the way of company." "I'm not afraid of quiet," he nodded toward the barn. "There's a stall you can use to wash up, pumps stiff in the morning, but it runs." "I'll manage." As she walked toward it, Ezekiel returned to his work. The wood split clean under his hands, but his thoughts didn't. He'd built this life from silence and hard labor, and it had held together fine until yesterday. Now a woman and a child slept under his roof, and nothing felt settled anymore. Later, inside, the smell of cornmeal warming on the cast iron griddle filled the room. Delaney stood barefoot, sleeves rolled to her elbows, Liam perched on her hip, gumwood spoon in her other hand. She didn't look like someone passing through. She looked like she belonged in the light from the window, flour dust on her wrist, humming some tune he didn't recognize. "You didn't have to cook," he said, stepping inside. "I know how to thank someone, Ezekiel." "A hot breakfast's the least I can offer." He watched her turn the cakes, her movements sure and steady. "You sing when you cook, old habit. Mama used to say it kept the food from going flat." He pulled out a chair, boots dragging on the pine floor. "What tune was that?" "Just something from back in Missouri, about a river girl who married a trapper." He nodded slowly. "Did it end well?" Delaney looked over her shoulder. "Only song I ever liked that did." When they sat down together, Liam reached for everything with soft, clumsy hands, babbling nonsense between bites of mashed apple. Ezekiel watched the way Delaney guided his fingers, taught him patience with gentle murmurs and small nods. She didn't rush him. She didn't ever raise her voice. "He's watching you," Ezekiel said. Delaney looked up. "Babies do that, like they're memorizing your face." "He's watching like he knows you'll always be there." She didn't answer, just pressed her lips to Liam's temple and turned back to her plate. After breakfast, he saddled the mare, headed out to check the upper fence line. Near the creek bed, he found a stretch where the posts had sagged, worn down from age and wind. He'd have to set new ones before snowfall. As he worked, the sound of hooves caught his ear. He turned to see Delaney approaching, side saddle on the mule, Liam tucked against her chest in a sling she'd fashioned from an old flour sack. "I figured you'd need help hauling the rails," she said, dismounting before he could speak. "You ride better than most men I know. I rode fence with my father every spring, never saw the point in waiting for someone else to do what I could manage myself." He handed her a pair of gloves. "Hope you don't mind blisters." Not if it gets me warm by the fire tonight. They set to work, digging holes and driving the rails into place. Ezekiel kept glancing at Liam, who stayed quiet, eyes wide as he watched the cold world go by from the warmth of his mother's chest. Delaney didn't complain once, even when her hands went red from the cold, even when the sun dipped behind the hills and the wind picked up. By the time they headed back, the sky had turned to ash and the first snow flurries danced on the breeze. Inside, she laid Liam on the pallet near the hearth, covering him with a quilt she'd found in the cedar chest. Ezekiel poured her a mug of coffee, then sat across from her, the fire throwing gold across her face. "You ever think of setting roots somewhere?" he asked. "I did once," she said, eyes on the flames, "but everything I planted back then got pulled up." He watched her fingers trace the rim of the mug. "You could try planting again." Delaney looked at him, not with surprise, but like she was measuring something behind his words. "What if the ground's no good? Sometimes it just needs time and someone willing to work it." She didn't look away for a long while, then she nodded just once and turned back to the fire. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, soft and slow, the kind that stayed. By the second week, the snow had settled into the folds of earth like it meant to stay. The fields wore a white hush, and the livestock moved slower, their breath rising in clouds as Ezekiel and Delaney worked to keep the animals fed and the barn dry. The days shortened fast, dusk arriving before supper, and the quiet inside the house grew thicker with each long evening. Delaney had taken to sewing in the evenings after Liam was asleep, patching old shirts and altering a pair of trousers from a trunk Ezekiel hadn't opened in years. She did it by lamplight, fingers nimble, eyes steady. He hadn't asked her to, but she didn't wait for permission in the first place. "You were wearing this one in that photograph," she said one night, holding up a chewed-up flannel sleeve. He glanced up from whittling near the hearth. "That was my brother's shirt." She paused, cloth draped over her knees. "He gone long since Shiloh." She didn't press, just nodded and folded the shirt up, setting it aside. Liam stirred in his cradle, a soft sound that barely broke the hush. Delaney rose, tucked the blanket closer around him, and sat again without a word. Ezekiel watched her as she settled, her chin dipping toward her chest in a way that told him the day had taken more from her than she was letting on. "You've been running on empty," he said. "I've been worse, still." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It doesn't have to be all on you." She met his gaze, not defensive, just tired. "It's not like I planned for any of this, but I swore I'd keep him safe. That meant getting here. That meant staying if I could. You have. That doesn't mean I don't wake up wondering if I'm doing right by him," she said, voice low. He lost her before he could understand what losing meant. "I don't want the next thing he knows to be more leaving." Ezekiel looked toward the cradle. "He won't know that here." Her shoulders eased a fraction. "You mean that?" "I don't say much I don't mean." She folded her hands in her lap, then looked toward the window pane where snow gathered like lace in the corners. "Back in Missouri, I had a job mending dresses at Mrs. Enderby's dry goods. I was saving to move us both west. Clara was supposed to come too once she was strong enough." Her voice caught. "She didn't make it that far." Ezekiel said nothing, just watched her. Outside, the wind pushed against the eaves, soft and steady. After a while, Delaney rose and reached for the kettle. "You want more coffee?" He stood, took the kettle from her hands. "Sit down, I'll get it." The next morning, the pump handle stuck with a layer of ice. Ezekiel struck it gently with the back of his hand to loosen it. Delaney stood beside the barn door, brushing snow off the feed sacks. "These'll have to stretch through February," she said. "If you've got seed oats, I can make a mash to keep the cow from thinning too fast. There's a barrel in the root cellar. I'll haul it up this afternoon." He glanced at her boots, soaked through at the toes. "You'll need something warmer." "I've stitched wool into the lining. They'll hold." He nodded, then paused. "You're good with your hands." She lifted her head, surprised. "Nobody's ever said that like it was worth something." "It is." She studied him, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You're different than I expected." "How so?" "I figured you'd be sharp-edged, closed off." "Men who live alone usually are." "I was." Delaney didn't smile, but something softened in her expression. Why aren't you now? Ezekiel looked toward the hills where a line of mule deer had crossed overnight, tracks crisp in the snow. Maybe because someone showed up and didn't ask me to be anything but useful. She looked down at her hands. You've been more than useful. That night, Liam cried longer than usual. A tooth was coming in and his cheeks had flushed with heat. Delaney rocked him slow, humming while Ezekiel boiled willow bark over the fire. She dipped a cloth in the cooling tea, pressed it gently to the baby's gums. Liam whimpered but quieted. You know he calms faster when you're near, she said. Ezekiel sat on the floor beside her, watching the boy's tiny fists uncurl. Maybe he knows I'm trying. You are, he looked up. So are you. She didn't look away this time. I never wanted to do this alone. I told myself I could, but that was before I saw how heavy it really is. You're not alone now. She reached out then, her hand brushing his where it rested on the floor. It wasn't a grand touch, but her fingertips lingered and he didn't move away. The room held stillness, but it wasn't empty. It was full of something unspoken, something beginning. Later, once Liam had drifted off again, Ezekiel set more wood to the fire. Delaney stood at the window, her silhouette edged in firelight. I never thought I'd end up here, she said. Neither did I, but I'm glad you did. She turned slowly. Ezekiel, if I stayed, you already have. He stepped closer, took her hand in his. This time she didn't let go. The creek had frozen shallow along the banks by mid-November, edges laced in white while the center still moved under a skim of ice. Ezekiel walked the fence line with Delaney following a few paces behind. Liam bundled into a sling against her chest, his breath fogging the wool tucked around his chin. Wires holding better than I expected, she said, brushing snow from a post cap with her glove. You stretch it last winter, spring. He crouched, tugging at a tie. Used to do it with my brother. He had a better eye for tension. You ever think of bringing on a hand come spring thaw? He stood, brushing his hands on his coat. I did once. Never could keep one longer than a season. Why's that? Too many miles from town, not enough pay. She smiled faintly. Doesn't sound like you were trying to keep them. I wasn't. They walked on, snow crunching underfoot. A hawk passed overhead, shadow slipping across the slope. Liam stirred but didn't cry, lulled by the steady motion of Delaney's steps. You said your brother was the one who stretched fence with you, she said after a while. Was he older? By 2 years. What was his name? Caleb. She adjusted the sling, tucking the wool higher. You talk about him like he's still around. He is, in pieces. They reached the north gate where the land sloped into low scrub. Delaney rested her hand on the latch, watching the hills. I asked because Clara kept a journal. She wrote about a man who carved things from pine when he couldn't sleep, said he used to give her birds for her windowsill. Ezekiel's jaw worked, but his voice stayed level. That was Caleb's doing. I was the one who taught her to shoot. She never mentioned that. She wouldn't have. He turned back toward the house and she followed, their footfalls quiet under the sky. At the barn he paused. You still thinking about leaving? I was. Before I knew you carved birds. That changed something, she met his eyes. It tells me you come from gentler stock than you let on. Inside the house, Liam was laid down in the cradle, and Delaney stood at the stove, sleeves rolled again, stirring onion into a pan with leftover salt pork. The scent filled the space, unfamiliar but welcome. Ezekiel sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of water drawn fresh from the well that morning. You ever think about marrying? She asked, not looking up. I did. Once. What stopped you? I went to war instead. Delaney turned, wiping her hands on a cloth. You think it would have worked? It might have, but I never came back the same. She crossed to the table, sat across from him. You've changed again, you know. How? You listen more than you used to, and you look at Liam like he's something you want to understand. Ezekiel leaned back slightly. He is. Delaney rested her chin in her hand, watching him. I didn't expect you to be kind. I thought you'd take one look at us and send us down the hill. I almost did. Why didn't you? He looked toward the cradle. Because you were scared, but you weren't begging, and because I knew Clara. She wouldn't have sent him unless she believed I could be better than I was. Delaney's voice dropped. She believed it. I didn't understand why, but I do now. The wind picked up outside, brushing against the windows like soft fingers. The stove popped once, then quieted. Liam stirred but didn't wake. Ezekiel stood, walked to the mantel, and reached for a small pine carving tucked behind the lamp. He turned it over in his hand, a sparrow, wings tucked, eyes round. "I made this one the night before I left for Virginia," he said. "Didn't know what else to do with my hands." Delaney came to stand beside him. "You kept it." "I didn't have the heart to throw it out, and I didn't have anyone to give it to." She held out her palm. "You do now." He placed it gently in her hand. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he reached for her other hand, the one that had always been busy, always steady. She didn't pull back. "I don't know how to promise anything," he said. "Not in words." "You don't need to," she whispered. "I've seen what you do with your hands." He touched her cheek, rough thumb brushing the place where cold had left its flush. She leaned in, slow and certain, and when her lips met his, it was quiet, unhurried, like everything that had come before it had been leading here. When they pulled apart, Liam let out a soft sound, half sigh, half breath, and Delaney smiled, forehead resting against Ezekiel's. "We'll make this work," she said. He nodded. "We already are." And outside, snow kept falling, soft as dust, covering the world in something new. The last of the snow fell in early December, heavy and wet, clinging to the roof in thick drifts and darkening the barn's beams. Ezekiel spent the better part of 3 days shoveling paths from the house to the well and down to the fence line, while Delaney kept Liam bundled inside, warming bricks near the fire to line his cradle. The boy had begun to sit upright on his own, hands always reaching now, his world growing larger by the day. One morning, Ezekiel returned from cutting feed blocks to find Delaney standing by the window, her face still and unreadable. "There was a rider," she said. "Passed down the ridge, didn't stop." He pulled off his gloves, brow lowering. What he looked like? Tall, wore a black coat. I couldn't see much else. Could be someone from town checking the lines. She didn't move from the window. "He didn't ride like someone passing through." Ezekiel stepped beside her, scanning the white hills. The snow held no fresh tracks, already softened by the wind. "If he comes back, he'll leave a clearer mark." She turned to face him. "There's something I should tell you. Before we left Missouri, Clara borrowed money for Liam's medicine from a man who didn't give it kindly." He folded his arms, jaw tightening. "How much?" $15. "I paid what I could after she passed. But he said if we ever ran, he'd come find us." "You think that was him?" "I don't know, but I've seen men ride like they're hunting something." Ezekiel nodded once. "If he comes back, he won't find what he's looking for." Delaney's eyes didn't leave his. "I don't want you drawn into trouble." "Too late for that," he said gently. "You're here, so's the boy, that makes it mine too." She took his hand then, not for comfort, but for resolve. "I won't let him take what's ours." That evening, Ezekiel moved his rifle closer to the door and checked the locks on the barn. They didn't speak much over supper, but there was no distance between them, just the quiet that came from people who had already decided where they stood. 3 days passed and no rider returned. On the 4th, Delaney brought down a bundle of cloth from the attic crawlspace. "I found a bit of linen and some wool in the cedar chest upstairs, enough to make Liam a winter coat." Ezekiel glanced over from where he was oiling the harness straps. "You plan to use the gray wool? It's thick enough, and I've got a bit of blue thread left for the seams. He'll look like a little soldier." She smiled, hands already measuring. "Better that than a frostbitten one." As the days grew shorter still, the house filled with the scent of boiled molasses and wood smoke. Delaney began baking a little each afternoon: biscuits, a pan of gingerbread, even a rough apple tart using the last of the cellar fruit. Ezekiel added shelves to the kitchen wall without being asked, and she filled them with jars and folded cloth and a small wooden box he didn't recognize. "You made this?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. She nodded. "My father taught me how to work wood same as thread." "It's not much. It's solid, like everything you build." She touched the edge of the box, then looked up. "I want to stay, Ezekiel, if you still want us." He didn't speak. He stepped forward instead, cupping her face like it was something too precious to hold quick. She leaned into him, and when he kissed her, the world outside fell quiet, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. That night, after Liam fell asleep, they sat together on the floor by the fire. Delaney's head rested against his shoulder, her hand laced through his. "I used to think I'd never be safe again," she said. "That even if I found a roof, I'd always be running inside my own skin." "You're not running now." "No, I'm not." He kissed the top of her head, slow and sure. "You're home." Winter held them close through the turn of the year. The stranger never returned. Liam grew stronger, his cheeks fuller, his laughter echoing off the cabin walls. Ezekiel built a second cradle by spring, not for need, but because Delaney mentioned once that she'd always wanted a rocking one. She never asked twice. In late April, they exchanged vows beneath the cottonwoods, with only the birds and the creek as witness. Ezekiel carved 2 simple bands from cherry wood, polished smooth. Delaney wore her mother's shawl. Liam sat on her hip, tugging at her braid with the quiet certainty of a child who knew he belonged. Afterward, they ate bread and cheese and passed a flask between them near the riverbank. Ezekiel pulled her close, brushing his thumb along her jaw. "We're not what we were," he said. "But we're better now," she smiled, eyes bright. "We're whole." Years passed, but the cabin never quieted again. The garden grew wild in places, and a second child, a girl with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet, arrived one summer afternoon with no fuss. Ezekiel held her in calloused hands, stunned silent, while Delaney laughed softly through her exhaustion. They never left the land. They didn't need to. Life came to them in slow seasons: planting, harvest, first steps, first words, the sound of laughter through open windows. Hard things still came, as they always do, but they met them together, and love, the kind that starts slow and stays, became the light they lived by.